Hi, and welcome to Surviving 7th Grade Social Studies. Today's topic is going to discuss the impact of the Enlightenment. The first thing we're going to talk about is art. Art, music, books, all these things grew during the time of the Enlightenment. So it's no wonder this is called the Age of Reason. Artists used these new ideas of government and order and reason to really show balance and elegance. Also, one thing that kind of starts during this time is the novel. The whole idea of having a book that has characters that explore thoughts and feelings and actually give you some depth to a story. So it's just this new form of storytelling that actually includes a lot of twists that affect us today, because that's mostly what we read in class are novels. Now, moving on to the ideas of government. Some of the Enlightenment thinkers believed that the best form of government was a monarchy. But here's the trade-off here. For a monarchy to be the best form of government, it was expected that the ruler respect the rights of the people. So they tried to influence rulers to rule fairly. Because after all, this whole idea of the Hobbes type of government is that people are bad at heart and need somebody to rule over them. So that's where this idea comes from, which makes a lot of sense because it saves a lot of time. With one person in charge, you don't have to wait for laws to be passed. There's one person to go to talk to you about your problems, so there's a lot of benefit in it. But the downside is most of these monarchs were not willing to give up power. In fact, they would give up a little bit, but even if they wanted to give up a little bit of power, they could always take it back. It's not like they had to do this. So that's the downside to this whole idea of monarchy. Now, France played a major role in the Enlightenment. As you noticed in the other video, a lot of the ideas came from France. First of all, in the 1700s, Paris was the cultural center of Europe. In fact, most people from around Europe and the Americas went to hear new ideas in France. So it's no wonder that our U.S. Constitution, our Bill of Rights, all these important American documents come out of this time period. Most of the ideas actually come from people in France. We had a very, very close relationship with the people in France, and we still do to this day. And then writers and artists gathered in homes of the wealthy people to talk about ideas. So think about this as kind of a chat room, except instead of being a chat room online, it's more or less you actually meet in person. Now let's talk about salons. No, we're not talking about where you go to get your hair done. We talk about a gathering in somebody else's home. That's what these were called. They were called salons. In fact, wealthy women would host these in their homes for distinguished writers, poets, artists, musicians, political leaders, everybody to come together to discuss different ideas. It's this whole idea of a Socratic seminar. And really this goes back to Socrates. Gathering together in a group to discuss issues and problems, to where you try to solve problems. You come up with solutions. It's not just a gathering to complain about what's going on or complain about your problems. You're trying to solve the problems that you see. The people of the time that would have met there would have been probably some of the greatest minds of their time. This is a picture of a Parisian salon. So this is what we're talking about. Very kind of formal, elegant, but at the same time it was expected that you provide input and you talk about how to solve the issues that are going on. One of the most famous things that comes out of the salon idea is the encyclopedia. And Diderot is the one who created the first encyclopedia. You don't have to know his name, it's not important, but what you do need to know is that this made the way for a lot of the information we have today. Such as this. This is a modern encyclopedia. I call it modern. It was probably one of the last books to be published as an encyclopedia. Now, today we don't use books like that of encyclopedias. I have some in my classroom in the back that just sit there. They collect dust because we have new ways to get information. This led to places like Wikipedia, a free online resource that, yeah, it's hit or miss on whether the information is correct, but it's still a way for you to share information around the world. And then let's not forget about Google, the search engine that could actually give you any answer to a question that you ask. Now, with that said, it's not always accurate, but it still takes the place of the book form of the encyclopedia. So, the encyclopedia was made to be a complete cycle of knowledge and changed the general way of thinking. So imagine there was a book that could contain everything you need to know about the world. That's what this was. There were 28 volumes, so 28 different books. It was alphabetical and cross-referenced and illustrated. Now this is a big deal for everything to be alphabetical. So if you wanted to look up a topic, all you had to know was the first letter and you could pretty much find it. Also, everything was illustrated, so even if you struggle with reading, you could still see it. Now, chances are, though, if you bought the encyclopedia, you knew how to read. It was first published in 1751, and it cost $1,500, let's just say dollars, because that'll put things in perspective for you. So imagine it costing $1,500 a set. We're not going to focus on their currency and how much it's worth to us today, but imagine $1,500. That's still a lot of money in today's time. Here are a few pages from this first encyclopedia. As you can see, it's drawn out, fairly detailed, gives us a good bit of information about each topic, and although we can't read some of the things at the bottom because they're in French, you can see and kind of get a feeling for what this was and how huge of a project it was. In fact, this is an entire page right here. As you can tell, that's the human body. And this would have been a big deal. It would take a lot of time for somebody to create this, and that's why it was so expensive. That's why the cost was $1,500. Here is a subscription to the encyclopedia. As you notice, most of those dots, those red squares where there are more than 100 subscriptions to it, are actually in France. Now, you have a few here and there throughout Europe, but you can tell that most of the ideas of the Enlightenment were spreading throughout France. That's what this shows us. Here are the reactions. It became illegal to criticize the Catholic Church in France. Now, think back to 30 Years' War. France was on the side of the Protestants, but then after the war, Louis XIV decides, one king, one law, one faith. I'm going to make France a Catholic country. It's going to be just Catholic. That's why it became illegal to criticize the Catholic Church. But think back to Protestant Reformation. This was kind of illegal already then, and it still didn't stop Martin Luther spreading his ideas. So we're going to see that this doesn't really work with the Enlightenment. Also, since people started criticizing the Catholic Church, they felt that the government was next. So most of the works were actually banned. People that worked on the encyclopedia, people that were part of this whole Enlightenment movement, were jailed and exiled, and pretty much they tried to destroy any of the books that contained worldly information, tried to destroy their work. But imagine I post something on Facebook. You can't just destroy my phone and think that that's going to take it off of Facebook. It works kind of the same way. The ideas still spread. It didn't actually stop the spread of ideas. Let's talk a little bit about these enlightened despots. A despot is just an absolute ruler who maintains power by any means necessary. So that includes these absolute monarchs, but a lot of times a despot becomes much more power hungry, and we see that there's kind of this darker side to them. Some monarchs embraced the ideas and made reforms. And really, here's why. For one, it makes their country stronger. And then for another, it makes the people happy, so it makes their own rule more effective. But we're going to see that since they don't have to do these ideas, since they don't have to embrace the ideas and make reforms, they can always undo those reforms. They don't have to be permanent. So our first one that we're going to look at is Frederick the Great. He made reforms in religion and gave reduced censorship and improved education. We've seen Frederick the Great before with Prussia, and we already know a little bit about his background, that he really wasn't this military man like his father wanted him to be. So it's not really a surprise that he wants less censorship of his people. He wants to ban less of the work. He wants more education for his people. Here's what he did. He made changes and gave people religious freedom, improved their schooling, and improved the justice system. But here's where it stopped. In order to not upset the nobility in his country, he did not end serfdom. So a lot of these peasants were actually slaves to the wealthy landowners. They weren't really slaves in name, but at the same time the concept's the same. They're tied to the land, they have to work the land, they're forced to work the land, and they don't really get paid for it. So they pretty much more or less are slaves to these wealthy landowners. So it's great that they got more religious freedom and improved schooling, but overall their life didn't really change. The only people this probably would have affected would be this middle class, and we'll talk about the middle class coming up. The next is Joseph II of Austria. He made some legal reforms, gave freedom of the press and freedom of religion. He also abolished serfdom, which was a big deal. This is a big hit to the nobility, because without serfs, the nobility have less power. But we're going to see that this whole idea of abolishing serfdom doesn't have to last. After Joseph II actually dies, the nobility regain control of the serfs. They actually bring serfdom back into the land and undo the reform that he had done. So we see that even as powerful as Joseph II was to make this reform, after his death, things could just go back to the way they were. And this is kind of common. So just because you make a reform doesn't mean it lasts forever. The next thing is Catherine the Great of Russia. She made reforms based on Montesquieu and Bessarion, which abolished torture. She doesn't really accomplish her goals and then gave up after a peasant revolt. She then focuses on just expanding Russia, making it larger, making it better. Catherine the Great was influenced by the Enlightenment ideas, but really she met resistance from the nobility. It's not odd. The nobility had the most to lose out of reform because their titles, just by birth, gave them power over people. So with reforms, they actually lost power. So they fought her on the reforms. Here's the other thing. She wanted to end serfdom, but the peasants kind of got ahead of themselves and revolted, and it was actually pretty bloody. So she decides it's not a good idea to give these people freedom because, after all, if under serfdom they would revolt and kill people, what would they do with freedom? So she changes their mind and actually gives the nobles more power over the serfs. So it goes the opposite way. She just goes the opposite way of Enlightenment. And then she manages to gain new land for Russia, which dismantles Poland. Poland pretty much disappears off the map. We're going to see that Poland is going to be a place where Russia, Germany, all these kind of Central European places, countries and places will fight over and want that country. They had three other effects too. For one, they helped spread the idea of progress. For another, they thought that using reason to solve problems would make the world a better place. It made the world more secular and less spiritual. And finally, the Enlightenment ideas promoted the notion of the individual person was important. Now, here we come to the middle class. This class is going to be a very important class of people. So during the Enlightenment, there's a group that is growing with popularity, with wealth, but they're not growing with power. The middle class is becoming wealthy, but they didn't have social status since they weren't nobles. And then they had very little political power since they weren't nobles. So this whole idea of freedom and equality sounded pretty good to them, and they had the money to drive it. So this middle class is going to be important for us to focus on. They're going to be the ones that actually drive revolution, and we see that they're the reason that a lot of these reforms will stick.